the story of the power station. This area on the south bank, all the way up to London Bridge, wasn't really part of London. This was all part of a different county, and then the county of London in the late 1800s got bigger. What they were designed to do originally was simply to generate electricity, and Battersea was run by the London Power Company. Battersea provided about a fifth of all of the electricity in London at one point. There are two power stations here joined side by side. The first opened in 1929 and the second opened after the Second World War. So the first one was very Art Deco. They had money. It looked nicer. And then the second one was just an addition. And when they didn't have much money, they just simply extended it with brick. But what it did is it burnt coal, hence why the chimneys are enormous, because there were lots of detached cottages in this area, and the chimneys had to be high so that the pollution wouldn't get to those people. But this was still quite a polluted area. There was no tube or train station here, so people would have arrived here either by walking, cycling, or getting a bus. But this place became home, really, to thousands of people. Men and women that worked here. The men worked in the power department, they were the engineers, they worked in the smoky, smelly parts. And back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, the women worked in the kitchens, the offices, and then gradually that changed. Especially during the Second World War, when a lot of men were off fighting, the women took over the engineering jobs, and it changed the workforce in England. So in the main, I suppose the building is an example of Art Deco. So that came from France, Art Décoratif. Sometimes people, they just call it Deco. So it's a style of visual art. And it's not just about buildings. Obviously, we know Art Deco buildings. But it went into all forms of life. So ships, buses, trucks, cars, even the furniture that we have in our houses, and everyday objects were all inspired by Art Deco. So that was a way of combining modern style with fine materials, rich materials. It changed in the 50s and 60s. Modern architecture took over, so they were using more steel and more glass. But originally the idea of brick with a steel shell around it, buildings like this, they were and will remain protected, especially in this country. Art Deco is dying out. We're building more modern, and the buildings around Battersea Power Station are a bit more modern, a bit more steel and glass. But this brick building of 6 million bricks originally was iconic at its time, and the sight of it from anywhere you are along the river remains iconic. The man responsible for it was a man named Giles Gilbert Scott. He also built Bankside Power Station, now the Tate Modern, the Albert Memorial, and the red telephone boxes. The original proposals for Battersea were to have square chimneys rather than round, but he wanted the design to look a bit more ornate. He wanted it, as he said, to be a cathedral of power. The only other building of comparable size in London at the time was St Paul's Cathedral. And believe it or not, St Paul's Cathedral could fit into Battersea Power Station, into the main engine or turbine hall. As this was 1929, the original work began on the site. And as I said, it was in 2 stages. There were 2 sides. The first stage was finished, completed in 1935. Now the chimneys at the top, they are 101 metres from the ground. That's about 330 feet. So we're talking the chimneys themselves being about half of that, and then the building being half below. So the towers are about 50 metres, about 165 feet, and then the chimneys themselves are the same. 1935, the first stage of the power station began. 1940, RAF pilots, they used, obviously there would be white smoke coming from the top of it, and they would use the chimneys to guide them home in the mists of London. The other side of this, the RAF pilots used the smoke to get them home. The enemy also used the smoke for navigation to get them into London. And it probably explains why the power station itself, a lot of areas why the power station avoided bad bombing, because the Germans knew that it would be a guide for them, so they'd rather leave this alone. 1944, the second side of the power station starts to generate electricity. It's really burning coal to create steam, which then will work the turbines and then generate electricity. A fifth of London was powered by Battersea. 1955, the complete second stage of the power station is complete. We're talking about a building that people are looking at saying, I wonder if I could work there maybe one day. And then in the 1950s, post-war, they wanted a workforce, so they started to employ apprentice engineers. And of course it meant for the power station themselves, they didn't need to pay as much for the apprentices, if anything at all. So the workforce got bigger and the costs got cheaper. 1977, an inflatable pink pig floats between two of the chimneys, and that's on the front cover of Pink Floyd's album Animals. So over the years, the power station was being used. It wasn't as efficient, but it still retained this iconic status, and then that ended up being regulated. So people knew in the future, even if the power station closed, it would have to be part of the skyline. It starts to generate less electricity. Other power stations were more efficient, and in 1983, the power station closes. It was purchased by a company called Battersea Leisure, and then in the 90s by a group called Parkview. And the idea was to make Battersea Power Station a theme park. That didn't happen. What did happen was that a Malaysian company bought it, and work began 2012. So this was a recycling depot around and about Battersea Power Station. So again, no tubes, no trains in the area. It was simply an area where people drove, they worked. It was still an industrial site around and about. And then in the 80s, when gradually it ceased, a lot of the workers came back just to say goodbye to the power station. And the silence and the echo, they said it felt very ghostly. There's so much trivia to do with Battersea Power Station. It could have been Michael Jackson's, I suppose, fantasy park. He came to England in the 1990s, and he made friends with Muhammad Al-Fayed, and the two of them, Muhammad Al-Fayed of course ran Harrods at the time, but the two of them had this idea that they would make this a kind of self-contained theme park. That never happened. During the Second World War, the Bank of England sent surplus banknotes here, so they were burned as well as the coal to then generate the steam, to then generate the electricity. The reason they were burning the surplus, I suppose, was there was a prospect maybe of an invasion. It was kind of looming over the country, so they didn't want to get money into the enemy hands. But a lot of the people that I read the interviews of, they said that some of the notes wouldn't really make it into the coal burning thing. So some people might have made an absolute fortune. So not only been an iconic site just to look at for people travelling to and from work, it has appeared in many music videos. It's also appeared in a lot of TV shows and films. The great TV show Doctor Who has used the location many times. Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, Batman The Dark Knight, that has used it as a film set. The King's Speech used the control room as, I suppose, a 1920s recording studio. The Beatles film Help came out in 1965. Monty Python's Meaning of Life, they also film in the control room. Superman 3 in the 1980s. And Children of Men in 2006.